Thursday, July 11th, 2019, Maneco 64, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. No early video today. I was busy this morning. I didn't have time to make a video, unfortunately. I just got back home about 45 minutes ago. Today, I want to talk about how I feel that in the West, Western Europe that is, United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, we're moving more and more towards third world country status. And why do I say that? Well, because we're getting more and more inflation. We're getting more and more wealth disparity or inequality. The very rich are getting very, very rich, and there are fewer and fewer. The middle class is being hollowed out. And the difference between, especially the well, not even the very poor, just the middle class and the very rich is humongous. It's getting really big. And that's one of the reasons, of course, why there's populism growing. But I want to talk about, though, how you can actually survive and sometimes even thrive in a third world economic environment. And why am I qualified to talk about that? Well, for those of you who don't know my background, who haven't listened to my videos for a long time, I have been on YouTube for about 3.5 years. And I have spoken about my background. So I will go over it again for those of you who don't know, and why I think I'm qualified to talk about how to try to survive in this environment. Well, I was born in Brazil in 1964. That's why it's Maneco 64. And I grew up in Brazil up until the early 80s. I went to university in Florida in the States in 1982. I was still coming back home and stuff for holidays. So I grew up in the 70s and 80s. It was a period of very high inflation. I know there was high inflation also in the US in the 70s, but in Brazil it got even worse in the 80s. And fortunately for me, my family, my father was able to provide for me and my sisters and the family. And we survived. And I have to admit, we even thrived. My father did well in business. And why did he do well in business? Aside from what you have to do in business, I think one of the main things was that his business was international. So a lot of his earnings were in US dollars. And you have to understand that even when my dad started working in the 50s in Brazil, the dollar was good as gold, right? It was still under the Bretton Woods gold exchange system. And even in the 70s, the dollar, even though it had a bad period up until 1980, the dollar is still almost as good as gold, especially for a country like Brazil, where we had hyperinflation in the 80s. So that's how you kind of survive. You have to have options if you are able to. In Brazil, and it's still the same today. People who have dollars do fairly well in Brazil. And that's where also I want to talk about Glint. The debit card I spoke about yesterday. I made a video interview with the CEO of Glint, where you can basically store gold in a private vault in Switzerland and actually spend your gold if you need to. And to me, at first when I saw that, I thought, why would I want to spend my gold? But I just thought about it, how things were in Brazil when I was growing up. My father, of course, had access to dollars. He earned a lot of his income in dollars from his business. So, and at the time, the dollar in Brazil was like having gold, because the Brazilian currency was being so debased, pretty much like the major currencies now are being debased in the West, that every month the dollar got stronger and the local currency got weaker. But that didn't mean that my father would not sell some of the dollars to get an income in the local currency. So yes, I'm holding on. I'm not saying I'm selling my physical gold, but I think glint is like an alternative and a good option to have, especially if the situation gets even worse. And I think it will, because as we've seen, the central bankers are going to continue to print. They're going to continue to cut rates. We saw yesterday, Jay Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, he testified to Congress and he pointed to more rate cuts, right? The market was getting a little bit funny that they might not cut, but he kind of dispelled these fears. And we saw the stock market rally. The S&P made a new high above 3,000. We saw gold turn around from below 1,400 and trade all the way up actually to 1,427 this morning. So I think we're moving more and more towards a third world country environment. And I actually think it's by design. I will put a link in the cards above and in the description below to a speech by the former president of the World Bank, James Wolfenson. I'm not sure when he gave the speech, but he talks about how it is the policy of the powers that be to basically transfer the wealth from the West to equalize the West and the East. And that's been the policy. That's what China is all about. And I think it's going to get worse. So the West is going to, on average, get poorer, and the East is going to get richer. And that's a policy of the powers that be, people at the World Bank, at the IMF, at the central banks. They don't really care about the people in the West. They don't care if the middle class is hollowed out. They want Asia, China, India, all these countries, their population to catch up to us in the West. And that's the policy. And yeah, he gave the speech at, I think, Stanford University. So yes, I've got some comments from the interview about glint, that if you don't hold it, you don't own it. I partly agree with that. But can you imagine if it gets like Brazil in the US or in the UK? I think it's quite a convenient way. You could, for example, when you get paid in your local currency, you could swap those wages into gold in your glint card and protect yourself. I know gold could go down sometimes, but that's what people do in these third world countries. They keep their dollars for as much as possible, as long as possible. But when they need to change it, they do, and they usually keep getting more and more of their local currency. So that's what I mean. I think it's a good insurance to have the card, and yeah, it doesn't mean to say that I'm getting rid of my physical gold and that you should sell your physical gold. I don't think things are going to get any better because the powers that be, the people in charge, the 1%, Wall Street, they're in charge of the system, and they're going to keep inflating the system so that they can keep their power. And it's all going to be at your expense. That's why the cost of living is going to keep going up. And it's going to become like a third world country, unfortunately. So that's what I wanted to talk about today. The other point I'd like to make about glint, someone asked, oh, how much did you get paid to do that interview? Actually, I didn't get paid anything. I actually got a glint card last year here in the UK, and I've used it. And I was contacted by Glint. I went to meet them, and the deal with Glint that I have is that when the card gets launched in the US, hopefully soon, I will have a promo code. And if you were in the US and you get a Glint card, you can use my promo code, and I will be rewarded by Glint for that. That's all. I didn't get paid for doing that video yesterday, so I just wanted to make that clear. So what about the markets? Today it's not an early market report. the markets have been open, well, for an hour and 15 minutes in the US. I noticed that gold was doing very well this morning, and it's come off during US hours, which is not surprising. We're now at 14.10, right near the lows. So we're down about $8 from yesterday's close. We got up to 14.27. But I think, yeah, the consolidation is ongoing, and I think we're almost ready to break out again. It could stay doing what it has been doing the last week or so for a little while longer. Silver did quite well as well. It was up at 15.33 this morning. Right now we're at 15.15. It's down about 7. So what about the stock market? Well, what I noticed yesterday, yeah, the stock market did rally quite a bit just before the testimony. I think it's because they released the text before the testimony, and that's why we got the move before 10 a.m. New York yesterday. But I noticed that even though the markets finished higher, they were well off their highs. This afternoon, I see the Dow is up 100, but I see that the S&P is virtually unchanged, and the NASDAQ is down slightly. Currencies, the pound has strengthened a bit, is up about 0.25%, 125.35. The euro is up 5 pips, so not much, 112.55. And the dollar is down about 0.2% against the yen at 108.28. Dollar yuan is unchanged, 687.50. Notice that crude oil is very strong. WTI is back above 60. It's at 60.40. Brent is at 66.62. What about the bond market? Well, yesterday the reaction to the testimony and Powell's comments was that the short end of the curve dropped about 5 basis points. The longer end didn't drop as much, but it came off from the highs. And actually today, the 10-year is up 3 basis points at 206. The 3-month is at 216. That's down 3 basis points. So the curve is disinverting a little bit. It is inverted still, but it's not as inverted as much. So it's interesting now that the short end is going down in yields because the Fed is saying that they're going to cut, right? But the longer end doesn't seem to be going down anymore. I think it looks like it might have bottomed at 2%. Could that mean that investors are starting to see that this policy is going to create inflation? And that should hurt the longer end. And that's what seems to be happening. Yes, you can survive and thrive in a third world country. Unfortunately, I think that's the way we're going in the UK, in the US, other parts of Europe. We have been going, in my opinion, since the last financial crisis in 2008 in that direction. Even though I was a teenager and growing up, I still remember it quite well. My father died about 20 years ago, so it's difficult. I've learned quite a bit since he died about monetary history and what goes on in terms of inflation. But yes, I think the way to protect yourself is to have an alternative to the local currency. Yes, when I was growing up, the dollar was that alternative. It was as good as gold when my dad was starting up in the 50s and in the 60s. It was so, and it's still, for a lot of third world countries, the dollar is still seen as a safe haven, even though, of course, it's not going to stay like that for a long time. So what do you do in the US if there is no alternative to the dollar? Well, you've got the alternative of gold, precious metals, gold and silver. Yes, I hold the great majority of my precious metals physically. Here's got some silver here. Glint, I think, is just a tool to help you. And it will actually, I think it will come in very handy in the future, especially looking at the way things are going with the policies that are not going to change. The only way they're going to change this inflationary policy is when things just collapse, because they won't be able to do it anymore. But they're not they tried to normalize it, and you saw what happened with the Fed, right? So if you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. You can also follow me on Twitter, Steemit, and on DTube. I wish you all a great rest of the day. Take care. Bye.